Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join His mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.
Well, I am really excited about this conversation here on Missions Pulse. We've had a lot of great guests over the many months that we've been doing Missions Pulse, and today we got a unique conversation because we're talking about innovation in mission or innovation in missions. All these creative ideas, the way that God formed you, the creative bent that He put inside of you, He put there for a purpose. He is, after all, that creative God. And I have with me a guest, Jon Hirst. He is the co-founder of Generous Mind. You can find that at generousmind.com. And also, he's the Director of Program Innovation at SIL International. Really excited about this conversation. I think you're going to be intrigued and hopefully inspired. Hey, it's great to have you on, Jon. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Good to be with you.
Well, we first met, I think, face-to-face. We've been Twitter buddies for some time now, but we met face-to-face at finishing the Task Conference 2017, I think?
Actually, I don't think we've met in person, David, but
really?
Just a lot of social media interactions, I think.
I was going to say, you're really making me out to be some sort of stalker now. I feel like I've stalked you so much, now I know you.
That's right. Well, that's the way it is in our world today. We get to know each other via all these digital means, and it seems like we've spent time together. We connect that much, right?
Right. We share a similar passion too. And I love this passion that you've been on for some time. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to catch people up here with your kind of background. How did you come into this role? But kingdom innovation or innovation in mission, it's not a topic we generally talk about.
For sure. It's something that is really important to the kingdom and has been essentially kind of in the background all the way through. If you look all the way back through the scriptures, you see how God is always doing a new thing. But the idea of doing it as a discipline is not necessarily been something we've thought of. We've just done it just because we've had a huge challenge. And when you have a huge challenge, you do new things, right? And so it's been one of those things that has been done well over many, many centuries, but not necessarily talked about well.
I see. And I would be remiss to mention, are we lagging behind some currents of culture in the Christian world? I mean, generally, typically, if you're going to visit some Christian websites or ministries, they might not be the most avant-garde on the market.
Yeah, I would not answer it quite that way. There's a narrative that we hear a lot that nonprofits are behind and we don't have the resources and all that. And I think there's some truth to that narrative, but I think it's overplayed in the sense that what I think the real issue is not that we're not innovative, but we don't have all the professional words and practices and systems of the big corporate world around innovation. Meaning the kind of innovation we do is very deprofessionalized and organic, whereas the innovation that we see in the marketplace is very systematized and programmatized. And so what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do with a lot of the work that I'm doing, is harness the wonderful innovation that's already happening in God's kingdom and give it some of the key professional understanding that will help it to be more effective and more impactful.
Awesome. Okay, I love you clarifying that, and I think it's a fair assumption then to mention that, or something to point out. Now, why don't you catch us up a little bit with your journey, because it's not something that you naturally come into to start a website called generousmind.com. What do you mean by Generous Mind? How did you come into this position where you're really trying to harness people's creativity and make their ideation come to fruition?
Yeah. Well, my wife and I, we graduated from college together and with the same degree, and really felt God calling us to work as a team. And so we went to work for a ministry it was called back then Book of Hope International, and now it's called One Hope. And they distribute harmonies of the four Gospels to children in public schools around the world. And they hired us to come and do one of the very first interactive youth evangelistic websites back in 1998. Wow. So the real early days of the internet. And it began in us a passion and a commitment to essentially design and develop new things. They surrounded us with a board of really top-notch people from industry and kind of just said, hey, go figure it out. And so in that environment, it was very innovative, very entrepreneurial environment. That kind of launched me into framing my career in ministry around that sort of activity. And then I just spent my whole career in various roles, all doing similar things to that. And I think it was about our 10th anniversary. My wife Mindy and I were talking and just, kind of evaluating, where God had us and what we were up to and what he wanted us to be up to. And this idea, she really came up with it first, this idea that what we really wanted to do was help people to be generous with their ideas. It kind of was birthed in us, this idea that being generous with ideas, we're already generous with our time, with our talent, and our treasure, but so many of us have wonderful ideas that are just locked away. And so this idea of being a generous mind or being generous with the ideas that God has given us connected with that entrepreneurial and innovative spirit that kind of was at the very beginning of our career, and then God kind of has developed throughout a whole bunch of roles and startups and ministries and things. Those two things have kind of come together and melded into the work that we do today. On the side with Generous Mind is more of a think tank, and then my full-time role with SIL, really helping develop innovators within SIL and designing new programs and services for SIL.
Excellent. And I mean, the whole theme, though, of this is very much Great Commission. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, I think I've always been involved in Great Commission work. I grew up as a missionary kid in Latin America.
Oh, did you?
Grew up in Argentina and then in Venezuela. So I've always been connected to and involved in the Great Commission. I would say my heart is to view that Great Commission in the broadest sense possible. While I've done a lot of work with focused on the unreached and focused on the kind of the frontier mission side, also supporting a lot of the other areas of mission that are focused on discipleship in the existing church and trying to see innovation and idea sharing throughout all those areas, because of course they're all needed. They just are different in their role and kind of the place they are in the kingdom.
As you're talking about this, are you describing something like a BAM initiative, business as mission? Or I think you're alluding to something that goes a little bit beyond that, right?
Sure. I mean, the kind of things that I've been trying to apply innovation to have been very, very broad. So, of course, it could include business as mission or business for transformation, those kind of things, as well as more traditional mission where you're essentially working in church planting and planting churches directly. Or it could be in discipling and deepening the existing church in places where there's a historic church, right? In every one of those environments, there's a great need for innovation and new thinking. It just looks a little different and has a little different flair as far as the role of the missionary in instigating that innovation.
Okay, if that's the case, why don't you tell me a little bit about that flair? Because I think you're painting this broad stroke right now. People are like, yeah, we want to see innovation and mission. We want to see Christians who are avant-garde or on the forefront of kind of creative think tank kind of stuff. What are some of these implementations that you've seen? People with a creative idea, something that you've helped through Generous Mind, maybe SIL, put into action or put into work?
One example that I might give is one of my last roles before joining SIL was I led an organization called GMI, Global Mapping International. And one of the really cool examples of innovation and mission, I think, is the kind of the starting story of GMI, where it was in the 80s, and it was the very, very beginning of personal computers. And literally a few guys in a garage in San Francisco going, there's this new technology around mapping that makes it possible for us to create digital maps. And wouldn't it be amazing, just like William Carey used maps in the early part of the modern missions movement, wouldn't it be amazing if we could map some of the needs of the Great Commission around the world, wow, whether it be percentage evangelical or number of churches or languages spoken or all these sorts of things. And they literally sitting in a garage in San Francisco, you had some of these techies working on how do we implement mapping for missions, but doing it, some of the early tech was actually done for missions instead of for other purposes.
Wow, that's cool.
And then that technology was integrated into the secular and the business community after it was imagined for the missions community.
Okay, so are you telling me you had a part to play in Google Maps, or you were hanging out with Bill Gates back in the day, or what?
No, it was before that. And it wasn't me. This was pre-me. I wasn't involved in GMI back then, but the founders of GMI literally were doing some of the very, very early digital mapping.
Wow, cool.
Even before there was a commercial product out on the market, because they saw a missions need for something that didn't yet exist in the market in the way they needed it.
Yeah.
And so that's a great example of missions actually kind of leading the way, and then the market catching up with missions, because missions had a very specific need that the market hadn't even imagined a product for yet.
Yeah, wow, that's exciting. And you'll see that kind of reality now if you visit a site, let's say like Joshua Project. I know for sure ThaiChurches.org, Dwight Martin is one of those here in Thailand who maps daily statistical data of every single Christian and leader and church throughout the nation that I'm recording from right now in Thailand. And that tells hard data and strong percentages of unreached in that specific instance. So that's powerful to see that Christians or missions-minded people leading the way there.
Yeah, I think it was a great example of innovation, because you have a very specific need that the missions community had. There was not yet a solution in the market that was just something they could grab off the shelf. And so, like so many missionaries did throughout the course of history, they said, well, I'm not going to let the fact that there isn't a solution off the shelf stop me. I'm going to come up with what I need.
Awesome. Yeah.
And again, we've seen that over and over again throughout history, how the passion to reach the lost has driven missionaries and believers to come up with new ideas in order to advance the work.
And propelled it in many different ways. I mean, I remember my early days in China. I moved there in 1998. I was 18 years old. And I found at this little market in a back alley in China, in southwest China, all these old maps. They were dated, they were at the late 70s, but they were maps per county and then per prefecture in southwest China in Yunnan province. About 85 or 90 of them. So I would go out into these bush areas, the very rural countryside, with my stack of maps, pull out the one that coincided where I was and try to read all these maps, to see how to get to the next village. So had that innovation come a little bit earlier, you better believe I would have been downloading it firsthand.
That's right. No, very, very important for mission work for sure. And I think about SIL's work, I think the same way. SIL runs something called the Ethnologue, which is really like the encyclopedia of all the languages of the world. And why does a nonprofit ministry run that? Well, it's because back when we were starting to work on Bible translations of the languages of the world, there was no list of languages, right? And so missionaries had to develop the first one. And so now SIL gets to manage the ISO standard for language names, not because there's no one else that could do it today, but because back in the day when we were starting out 85 years ago, there was no one doing it yet. We were really on the cutting edge of doing that work at the beginning of the century.
I love that you mentioned that, and it immediately points in the direction of this creative God who infuses his people with creativity. The God who created the heavens and the earth, as we read in Genesis, the creation and the creativity of God does not stop in the first book of the Bible. You can see that creative element all throughout. Is that some of kind of that passion at Generous Mind, and obviously implementing their SIL, that you would like to harness? You're helping people and their ideation and their innovation come to reality.
Yeah, I think that is an important element. I think one of the things that I've noticed is that there's a mixture of things in the nonprofit world that both help nonprofits be innovative, but then hold them back. So one of the things that helps us is our passion, right? We have a great passion to accomplish some good in the world, right? And if you're in a mission setting, it's very much related to bringing people into the kingdom and helping them grow in the kingdom. In a broader setting, it could be good in the world related to poverty alleviation, all kinds of other things, right? But there's this passion there that's driving people. And that passion leads to a lot of creativity. At the same time, nonprofits are really designed to essentially keep away the latest and the greatest in order to do what works on the ground level, right? And so there's this sense of, I don't want to implement that because that's cutting edge, and where I work, that won't work, right? And so there's this kind of dual dynamic that we see in the nonprofit world. On one side, this passion that leads to great creativity. On the other side, these significant barriers that sometimes keep us from being creative. So one of the things that is really on my heart a lot is to find ways to help nonprofits realize how to harness that great passion they have, but how not to get slowed down by the barriers that they tend to face, and a lot of times tend to stop them in their tracks. And I think that becomes the real challenge. On the other side, I think there's the dynamic of how, when we think about what drives us to be involved in a nonprofit and be involved in mission, we're wanting to conserve something. We're wanting to keep something alive that maybe we feel is going away or is not being advanced. And that desire to conserve and to keep sometimes will cause us to be less risky, right? Because we're afraid of losing something, or afraid of seeing something go away rather than seeing something fully come into play. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. You're talking about something that I think all of humanity struggles with. First of all, risk.
Sure.
The element of risk, right? And then you have the statements by Hudson Taylor, and I think many of others have copied it over the years. Without the element, or where there is no element of risk, there is no need for faith. I think Elizabeth Elliot, Jim Elliot's wife, also continued to repeat that mantra, really. Without the element of risk, there's no need for faith. If you're talking about that in your experience, and as you see kind of a trend, who are the risk takers? I mean, it's not as natural for some demographics, right? As you go down the line, let's say from GI to Boomer to Gen Xer to Millennial, who are the risk takers that you're seeing today?
Yeah, I don't know that it's a generational thing so much, because I see innovators and risk takers. Sometimes it comes down to personality a little bit. There's certain personalities that tend to be more open to doing that sort of thing. But I think what I would use as a criteria is an empowered community, meaning that a lot of nonprofits, as they professionalized in the 80s and 90s, have put in a lot of systems that become very efficient working machines, right? So a lot of mission agencies, have really great HR now, and they have good finance, and they have legal structures in place. And some of them have ceased to be very creative and risk-taking. And so we see less creativity and risk-taking out of some of those areas, whereas they may be more efficient now, they may be less risk-taking. And then in other areas where there's more empowering of people to try new things, we're seeing more of that. And sometimes it's not about the age of the organization, or it's not about the age of the person, right? It's about what they feel empowered to do for the kingdom. Is there room in their organization? Is there a room in their own minds to try new things? Or are they really being driven by essentially by a lot of structure around what they do, where they feel that they don't have the permission to try new things?
Yeah, well, when you say try new things, obviously what that entails is a lot of failure. I think you ask a guy like Einstein or Elon Musk, you're going to get the answer. There was recently a video, Tesla, the car just comes out, Elon Musk is standing there giving his keynote presentation, and he has someone throw this metal ball into the window, and the windshield smashes the windshield, expecting it not to break, and he's like, oh, it's like one of those watch people die inside on YouTube videos, and Elon Musk is going, oh, well, should have strengthened that a little bit. Kind of a bit of a failure, although the ball didn't go through the window, and Tesla is still a great vehicle. But there's a lot of failure to get to the innovation crescendo that we want to see in mission. Yeah.
I think the other thing to go with that is that I think there, especially recently, because especially from the donor community, there is a less and less appetite for risk.
I see, yes.
There's more of a desire for stable and predictable outcomes of impact.
Wow.
Because that's true, that means that what essentially a lot of the donor community has said to the ministry community is, let someone else take the risk. We want you to deliver the impact. And because of that, we've begun to create an environment where there's less and less room for that. And so I think one of the challenges is how do ministries take advantage of systems and professional things like good HR and all those things, which are very important. How do they professionalize in some good ways, but how do they also empower the field to continue to rethink how we're going to reach the lost in a certain location or a certain field? And then how do we also communicate to the donor community what is expected outcomes that they should expect and where they're going to need to take risk in order to have the impact they want to have? And I think we haven't been very good at managing some of those dynamics in the ministry community.
Strangely enough, though, that is the very reason that those donors or vision partners come alongside that particular missionary or ministry in the very first place. Those are the ones who've stepped out beyond the borders, who've thought outside the box, pioneered this new thing. They're going, like Ralph Waldo Emerson, go where there is no path and make a trail. Immediately, again, the words of William Carey, father of modern missions, comes to my mind. Expect great things from God. Attempt great things for God. That's what draws people into this overarching vision, the vision that we share with Jesus, that all nations, all peoples, all ethno-linguistic tribes have an opportunity to hear the gospel, as we talk about unreached people groups. The very thing that draws people to sow their hard-earned money and prayers into a particular thing can become stifled over time. How do you even begin to address something like that at Generous Mind?
Well, I think that what happens is that we have two things going on. We have what we is something Dr. Paul Hebert talked about a lot. He talked about what's desired versus what is desirable. And what he meant by that was there are certain things that we desire, right? We want to go out on the edge. We want to push forward. We want to try new things. But at the same time, our flesh wants what's predictable. We want something that's a sure bet.
Wait, you're talking about yourself, not me.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
No, you're talking exactly about me. What's predictable, right?
Right. It's human nature, sure. Right? That's right. And because of that, we don't do a good job of negotiating those things. And we don't have words to describe it in the ministry world that are acceptable words. So partly what we have to do is we have to give it vocabulary. We have to be able to describe this desire for predictable ministry outcomes and this desire to go on the frontier and try new things. And we have to give ourselves words for these things. Because until you have vocabulary, you can't have a discussion. And until you have a discussion, you can't come up with ways of addressing both the good and the negative, right? And I think that's really where we are in the innovation space. We haven't really had vocabulary to describe. It's all been latent or implicit under the surface. And so part of what I'm trying to do with the work at Generous Mind, as well as our work at SIL, with the innovation work we're doing there, is to make innovation explicit and clearly understood, so that we know what the pitfalls are, so we know what the amazing opportunities are, and we're having those discussions in a way that's healthy for the kingdom.
Yeah, I really pray that as you do this, you're bringing conversation to the forefront that is not, like I said, the typical conversation in nonprofit world or missions world, for sure. Now, you're in this realm where you see all kinds of people coming and going. What is this underlying motivation to begin with? You're talking about innovation in mission, right? You're talking about harnessing these creative ideas and passions that we have for the sake of the gospel to extend the kingdom of God in our realms of influence. What is the overarching goal? What is the overarching motivation, or underlying motivation, I should say, that drives this whole thought behind you, Generous Mind, you, Jon, as well as the body of Christ?
Yeah, I think what drives it for me is that as I look at what has to yet be done before Jesus returns, and I look at the kingdom is coming in, we're seeing evidence all around us of the work that Jesus is doing, the kingdom he's bringing in, but we see these very large barriers. And what I realize is that the ability to address those barriers is going to require new thinking. And I see that in a lot of cases are the people that are coming into ministry have not been equipped, have not been trained on how to do that new thinking. And so they come with all this passion to impact the world, to be part of bringing in the kingdom, and they hit their first barrier, and it's like a slap in the face. Yeah. And they don't know necessarily what to do. And so I think a lot of what drives me is giving people in the kingdom of God the tools to respond to the passion that God has given them, to take that latent or implicit innovative ability they have that just has not been developed out, and give them the tools they need to then look at that barrier, use their passion, and apply tools and resources towards overcoming that barrier, whatever that barrier might be that they're facing.
Generally, that barrier comes in the first term for most missionaries, and hence you see one of the many aspects of the reason for missionary attrition. First year, second year, and can't hack this thing, and they're off the mission field. That is sad, but typical story. However, I just recently had on a couple people on the podcast here on Missions Pulse. It was awesome. I see what you're saying kind of at a grassroots level, or kind of rubber hits the road. Number one, just recently aired, a guy named Kelson Mudd. He's 18 years old. He's actually the son of the president of Adventures in Mission and World Race. 18 years old. He's the CEO of Clink Fundraising. Clink Fundraising is kind of like Acorns. It's a roundup kind of a platform, but specifically for missions. So instead of Acorns, you ask a donor or a person to give to your account, and it rounds up their spending dollars on the credit card up to the nearest dollar, put in savings or some sort of mutual fund. This is Clink Fundraising, clinkfundraising.com. Heavy shout out for you, Kelson. Hope you're watching, buddy. And goes to that missionary for their mission service. And they have this really cool slider on their website, clinkfundraising.com. If you get or have 130 people who've signed up to allow their credit cards to be rounded up on every expenditure to the nearest dollar, over a course of 6 months, you'll have $10,000 come into your account, kind of like passive donations or passive giving. I thought that was an incredible innovation that we need here on the mission field. Missionaries often struggle to fundraise. That was one of a couple that I saw. Have you ever heard of that?
I haven't, but I've heard of the idea generally. I hadn't heard of the missions application. I think one of the, there's a lot of different kinds of innovation. I think one of the things that I like about your example is that it highlights some of the different kinds of innovation. For instance, we tend to think of innovation only as what I would call disruptive innovation, meaning that innovation like the first iPod or, the first personal computer that essentially takes an industry and turns it on its head. But there's lots of different innovations. There's service model innovations, product innovations, incremental innovations. And one of the things that I think most ministry folks don't realize is that they're probably mostly not going to be doing disruptive innovation. That is very time intensive. It requires a lot of R&D. There's a huge amount of risk. But in some of these other types of innovation, like taking an existing model that credit card companies are already doing, but then applying it to the missions community, that's still innovation. It's just more of an incremental innovation into a certain space.
Yes,
right?
I like it.
Yes,
it takes less risk. It doesn't take as much R&D because there's already been thinking in that area, but it's all new thinking as it applies to a whole new space, right?
Yes, yeah.
And I think ministry folks need to realize that innovation doesn't have to be the guy in the garage in San Francisco. That's one way to look at it, right? But there's all kinds of other ways to innovate that are things that are much more accessible to the average missionary than Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, right?
Yeah, and if you don't mention that caveat, then you're painting a broad stroke that most missionaries will say, well, I can't do those kinds of things that so-and-so, Kelson Mudd or someone else. I'd like to also just point out, though, another group, and I'm sure you've heard about this one, Back to Jerusalem, backtojerusalem.com. Not a new movement. It started in the early 10s and 20s in China with this passion of Chinese to finish the task of the Great Commission by taking the gospel through the remaining blocks of Islamic, Buddhist, animist people groups into Jerusalem, from Xi'an to Xi'an, Zion to Xi'an, as they talked about it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so back to Jerusalem.com is having a couple things. Number one, the pill Bible. They have this pill Bible that's an hologram Bible, illuminates the air in front of you. This is kind of taking stuff, shifting it, turning it on its head. But they also host a hackers conference. And I've never heard of any nonprofit or ministry that's hosting hackers conferences. I thought that was a really cool idea and daring.
Yeah, absolutely. No, there's some amazing things going on in the kingdom. I think even though we talk about some of the challenges we have in applying innovation in the nonprofit community, at the same time, the movement of Jesus people working around the world to accomplish his mission is so diverse, and there are so many people being so creative. So you only have to, walk around and kind of start looking under different rocks, different places before you start to see all kinds of amazingly creative things. I think one of the challenges we have is that we haven't, until more recently, with things like this podcast and so many others, had a lot of ways to tell some of those stories. There haven't been as many vehicles, but with the democratization of essentially of information, we now have all these different voices trying to pull out these stories. And I think that is also helping us realize how creative the kingdom really is. Because for a lot of years, that stuff just never made the news, right? It never got people's attention. But it was always going on, right? It was just a lot of it was under the radar. And so I think that now we're starting to see more of it because there's more outlets that are allowing us to get a glimpse into what some of these amazing folks are doing around the world.
Absolutely. And with that, I love how you are highlighting these things, bringing them to the forefront. In fact, you recently, on Generous Mind and with J.D. Payne, we're having a 6-part conversation, I believe, webinar that is available on YouTube directly at generousmind.com. Tell me a little gist of what you guys talked about, because you talked 6 parts, 6 long videos. I think it was a total of 5.5, 6 hours. And so give me an overall kind of gist, pointing people back to Generous Mind and giving a little shout out for J.D. Payne. Yeah,
absolutely. So what we did was we do an annual event called Innovation and Mission. And it's an online event, and so that happens every year. And out of that last year, I had J.D. Payne on as one of our presenters and one of our speakers. JD and I were really praying about kind of what to do next and what some of the realities or dynamics we were noticing in the mission community. And what we realized was that there was a sense of not understanding what the kingdom has to say about innovation. So there was a sense of we know what missions looks like. We know what missions work is, all that stuff, and we know we have to be creative in that. And we know what innovation in the secular world looks like. All the different design thinking and all these strategies and all these things. But what does it look like for the uniquely kingdom version of innovation to be implemented, to be utilized in very practical ways? So that's what really drove the conversation that JD and I had. Him as a missiologist, me as more of a practitioner, saying, what does it really look like in the kingdom to be innovative? And so on each of these 6 conversations, we took a different aspect of innovation, and we really dived into scripture, but also into very, very practical application, going, what does it look like, for instance, to lead a team to do innovation in the kingdom? So, there's lots of horror stories we've heard about the entrepreneurs and innovators who aren't good leaders, right? Kind of yelling at their team and, really bad power dynamics and all these things, but they're very innovative, right?
Yeah.
And so we have that kind of narrative going on. Well, we know that's not the kingdom, right? The kingdom has this loving people and honoring them and helping them along in change management and all these sorts of things. So what does it look like for us to lead a team into change as part of the kingdom? And so we really wrestled with all that, and you can actually find the whole conversation at kingdominnovation.info, which is just a subset of the Generous Mind website. But I think it's really helpful because we really need to think through. We have to appropriate innovation into our world. It's one thing to say, here's what Blogger X, out at Hewlett Packard or, IBM or Apple or Google says about innovation. That's great and very helpful, and we need to think cross-disciplinary. But we also need to then bring those ideas into our kingdom work and go, based on our values, what does innovation look like?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not going to ask you to give away all the juicy details. I'm going to just simply point people to that conversation, 6-part conversation with JD Payne. And again, you mentioned innovation. What's the URL or link that they could find that?
So you can go directly to it at kingdominnovation.info.
Okay.
Or it's also on the generousmind.com website. They can find it there as well.
Yeah, that's where I was. I was on generousmind.com. I live there. I hang out there. You've also had some recent posts that I've really appreciated, both on chinasource.org, and I think you're connecting and having some conversations going to be happening with 1615 Ministries with Matthew Ellison. I'm really excited about this conversation. I really so appreciate you bringing this less talked about conversation to the forefront, because we serve a creative God, a God who is always creating. His very word creates. And if that God is the one who lives inside of us, regardless of our geographical coordinate, he can and will use us in our God-given creativities to advance the kingdom. I think that's the whole gist of what we're talking about here. Lastly, as we kind of close down here, give us a shout out for where you could point people to find out more about what you're doing, some of the projects maybe, or how to follow you on social media.
Sure. I think the best thing, of course, is the Generous Mind website as far as access to a lot of the webinars. Or you can go to innovationandmission.com, which is a section of that site as well that takes you straight to all the videos. I think on social media, you best find the Generous Mind Facebook page as well as the Twitter account. And then my Twitter account is Jon Hirst Talks, and I'm tweeting there a lot on DataViz, and a lot of my innovation content is on my own Twitter. Some of it's on Generous Mind as well. And then also, I would encourage people to connect on LinkedIn and do a lot of sharing of the application of business innovation language and thinking into the nonprofit community there on LinkedIn as well. And then through the generousmind.com website, we host a blog that talks a lot about innovation, and you can find it there as well.
All right. Well, thank you for that shout out. Lastly, think about this demographic, all these people listening, maybe watching here on YouTube. What is something, an encouragement, a challenge that you would, a sharp rebuke? No, let's leave that for the next time. What kind of encouragement would you give to those who are watching or listening right now?
Sure. I think I would encourage them and each of you listening with a simple definition of innovation. It's by a guy named Richard Lyons, and it's innovation is fresh thinking that creates value. And so as you think about what you're doing in your life today, in your ministry, think about what is the fresh new idea, the new way of thinking that God has put on your heart about anything. It doesn't matter. And ask yourself and ask God, what value does this have in the kingdom? And that's innovation, right? That's all it is. And so if you find new things that God is giving you to think about and work on, and you understand the value that it's bringing, you are an innovator. You are coming up with new things. And I would encourage you to lean into that, to own that, to be willing, like we talked about earlier, to take some risk, to be willing to try some new things, and just ask God for the strength, the resources, the mind share, the relationships, the opportunities to apply that new idea in a ministry setting for His glory.
Awesome. Strong encouragement for all those watching and listening. I felt like it was mostly for me, speaking right into a deep passion of my own for writing and creating and many different facets that I find myself pouring my creativity into. But hey, Jon, I really appreciate you taking the time here. So appreciate you coming on Missions Pulse. Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you, and pray that God would continue to bless your efforts at both SIL as well as Generous Mind, and continue to give you the strength as you extend His kingdom to places it has not gone before. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Blessings, my friend.
Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join His mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.